She didn't look like someone who would change the course of an entire flight. Just a quiet girl in a pale blue cardigan, aisle seat, row 17. She smiled politely when the man beside her asked if she could pass his tray back to the attendant. She murmured a soft "thank you" when the stewardess handed her a cup of water. No one remembered her name. Not yet. But 37 minutes after takeoff from Singapore to Zurich, something happened in row 23 that would burn her into every passenger's memory. A woman, heavily pregnant, suddenly gasped. The sound wasn't loud, but it was sharp, primal. The sort of sound that pulled your instincts awake. She clutched her belly. Her partner, wide-eyed and helpless, called out for help. The flight attendants rushed over. Panic started to ripple through the cabin. And then there she was. The girl in the blue cardigan stood up. She moved down the narrow aisle with the calm authority of someone who had done this before, even though she hadn't. She knelt beside the pregnant woman, spoke softly to her, and placed her hand gently on her wrist. She didn't panic. She didn't fumble. "I'm a medical student," she told the attendants, though she was only in her second year. "She's going into early labor. She's in distress." The attendants hesitated, looking to each other, to the intercom, to the emergency kit, unsure. The plane was flying over the Indian Ocean. There was no doctor on board. The girl took command. She asked for warm towels. Water. Pillow. She kept the woman calm, kept the man focused, directed the crew like a conductor. She asked one of the flight attendants to find a soft blanket and instructed another to call the captain, prepare for a possible emergency landing. All the while, she never left the woman's side. From row 1A, a man watched. He was tall, well-dressed, the type whose presence you felt before you noticed. He had been typing something into his laptop, a presentation or a financial forecast. But now he watched the girl, transfixed. She wasn't beautiful in a dramatic way. No makeup, no diamonds, just dark hair pulled into a loose bun. But the way she moved, with purpose, with empathy, that caught him, that held him. For over an hour, the girl stayed with the woman, helping her breathe through contractions, soothing her fears, even as the pain worsened. The pilot finally announced an emergency landing in Mumbai. Paramedics waited on the tarmac. When the plane touched down and the doors opened, the girl handed the pregnant woman over to the professionals, gave a brief report, and then quietly returned to her seat. She never asked for thanks, but thanks found her. The man from row 1A didn't wait. The moment the plane was grounded again and passengers reboard, he made his way back to row 17. She was reading a worn copy of Jane Eyre. "Excuse me," he said. She looked up, blinking, unsure. "I just wanted to say," he continued, "what you did, it was extraordinary." She blushed. "I just did what I could." He smiled. "That's exactly why I had to meet you." They spoke the rest of the way to Zurich. About medicine and books, and how she had nearly dropped out of university the year before after her father passed away. About his life too, reluctantly at first. He didn't mention the billions. Not yet. His name was Marcus Renner, owner of Renner Biotech, one of Europe's leading medical research firms. He rarely spoke about his company in casual conversation, but she mentioned how she wanted to work in underserved clinics, where research rarely reached. He listened with unusual silence. In the Zurich terminal, when they said goodbye, she didn't expect to see him again. She didn't even realize he'd taken her name from the passenger list. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at her apartment. No branding. Just a thick envelope with a wax seal and a handwritten note. "I believe in people who act without being asked. Would you allow me to support your studies?" She called the number. It was the beginning. They met again over coffee. Then again, at a symposium she was invited to, suspiciously last minute. Each time she saw something else in him. Humor beneath his seriousness. Stillness in his success. A man who, like her, had spent years pretending not to break. By winter they were inseparable. She never quite understood how he had fallen so fast, but he told her once, during a snowstorm in St. Moritz, that it was when he saw her pressing a cold bottle of water to the pregnant woman's forehead. "You were scared," he said. "But you did it anyway. That's rare. And rare things," he said, "deserve to be cherished." He proposed on a quiet Tuesday, no grand gesture. Just a ring and a question over tea. He said yes. But the story was only beginning. Because 3 months after their wedding, a scandal erupted. And this time he was the one in need of saving. The tabloids erupted first. Renner empire under threat. Biotech billionaire accused of data suppression. Was it all built on lies? It started with a whistleblower. A junior researcher claimed that Renner Biotech had hidden clinical trial data that showed their top drug, Neuronix, had adverse neurological effects in long-term patients. The media fed like wolves. Reporters camped outside their villa in Lucerne. Shareholders panicked. The board began to fracture. He didn't sleep for 3 nights. He sat at the edge of their bed, shoulders bent, eyes bloodshot, staring at a single line in the leaked email thread. It wasn't his name, but it was his company. And in the public's eye, that was enough. She stood behind him in silence, hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "They think I knew. That I signed off on the trials." She set the cup down on the table beside him and didn't say a word. Instead, she knelt in front of him and looked into his eyes. Not with pity, not with fear. With clarity. "Did you?" He shook his head slowly. "No, I didn't. But I missed it. I should have seen it." She studied him for a moment, then said something he never forgot. "Missing something isn't the same as hiding it. The truth doesn't collapse under pressure. But people do. So don't." He closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against hers. In the weeks that followed, she became something no one expected. Not just the billionaire's wife, standing beside him at press conferences. Not the passive figure in tasteful heels and neutral dresses. She acted. She read every report, poured through every document. Her knowledge of medicine, still fresh, still hungry, caught things the internal team had missed. She found inconsistencies, old messages between research heads that hinted at who knew what and when. She contacted patients herself. Gently, respectfully. Her empathy opened doors no lawyer ever could. And then she did something that turned the entire case on its head. She located the whistleblower. He was hiding in a small apartment in Copenhagen, terrified and angry. She flew there alone. No press. No entourage. She knocked on his door in a gray coat, holding nothing but a folder and a question. Asterisk, "Do you want to tell the truth or just a version of it?" Asterisk. He let her in. They spoke for 6 hours. He hadn't lied, there had been data buried. But it hadn't been Marcus. It had been a rogue division head, desperate to push the drug through to meet a quarterly deadline. The whistleblower hadn't known the full story. Only his part of it. By the end of that meeting, she had what no investigative team, no lawyer, no private investigator could get. The full truth. With documents, testimony, and a quiet, personal apology. 3 days later, she stood beside Marcus as the media filmed their arrival at the court. But this time the headlines changed. Renner cleared by internal audit. Wife played critical role. Medical student turned advocate exposes corruption from inside. Love, loyalty, and the long game. How she saved his legacy. And still she avoided the cameras. The board offered her a permanent advisory position. She declined. "I didn't do it to sit in a room of people in suits," she said. "I did it because he's my husband. And because science deserves better." He looked at her differently after that. Not with admiration but awe. The woman he had seen first as kind and capable had become something more. Unyielding, brilliant, unafraid. They returned home in early spring. The villa was quiet again. The snow had begun to melt. One evening, as they walked through the orchard behind the house, she stopped beside a blooming tree and touched her stomach, pausing. He turned, and she smiled. "I'm late," she said softly. He stared at her. And then, slowly, he began to laugh. The kind of laugh that had weight behind it. Relief. Oh, wonder. They stood beneath the branches in silence, the world momentarily still around them. But far away, in a quiet corridor of a public hospital, a child was waiting. One whose birth she had helped deliver months before. A woman in Mumbai had named her daughter after the girl who had been there when no one else knew what to do. And that child's name was about to echo in places no one expected. The name was Elara. It meant grace or immortal, depending on which part of the world you asked. In Mumbai, it had come to mean something else entirely. A symbol of quiet bravery. News of the in-flight birth had circulated only briefly, buried beneath louder headlines. But in a modest hospital on the city's outskirts, the story lived on. The nurses told it to new interns. The mother, Priya, shared it with other expectant women in the maternity ward. She came like light, Priya would say, rocking Elara gently in her arms. No hesitation. Just hands that knew how to help, and a voice that knew how to calm. What no one knew was that Emara's story would come full circle. Back in Switzerland, the girl in the blue cardigan, now Amelia Renner, was still adjusting to the idea of becoming a mother. She touched her belly often, as if still surprised. Marcus had begun making quiet changes. Less travel, earlier dinners, longer walks. The house filled with books on parenting and baby names and the philosophies of raising a child with compassion. One morning, Amelia found a small wooden box on her side of the bed. Inside was a silver bracelet, delicate and engraved. To Elara, the first child you brought into the world. And the reason I found mine. Marcus watched her read the inscription. She's not just a memory, he said. I tracked them down. Family. They're well. The father runs a small printing business now. They want to meet you. Amelia was quiet for a long time. Then, with tears in her eyes, she whispered, yes. The trip to Mumbai wasn't publicized. No cameras. No entourage. Just a private flight, a single overnight bag. And 2 people returning to the place where everything had begun. The reunion was simple. No fanfare. Just a modest apartment with paper lanterns on the balcony. And a family waiting at the doorway. Priya was thinner than Amelia remembered, but her eyes were the same. Warm, wide, grateful. Her husband, Ramesh, was all smiles and laughter. And Elara, now just over a year old, took her first wobbling steps across the floor that very afternoon. Toward Amelia. Something shifted inside her. Swell. Wave. Not just of memory but of destiny. This child had no idea what her presence had ignited. That she had been the first thread in a tapestry that now stretched across continents and through the heart of one of the world's most powerful families. Priya placed Elara in her arms. The little girl smelled of jasmine and baby powder and mango. She leaned into Amelia's chest without fear. And for a moment the world was still again. Later that evening, after tea and laughter and photographs, Marcus stepped out onto the balcony with Ramesh. The 2 men talked quietly. About fatherhood, business, fear. Amelia sat beside Priya, cradling Elara, and asked, do you remember how scared you were? Priya nodded. Yes. But I remember you more. On the flight home, Amelia didn't sleep. She stared out at the clouds, one hand resting on her belly. When Marcus reached over and placed his hand on top of hers, she turned to him and said something she'd never said before. I think this child was always meant to come. But only after I proved I could fight for someone else's. He didn't respond with words. He just held her hand. Back in Switzerland, life resumed. But it wasn't the same. Amelia launched a new initiative. Not a charity, not a foundation. Something smaller. More agile. A mobile medical unit that brought prenatal care to underserved areas around the world. They named it the Elara Project. And the first team was dispatched to Mumbai. But the true turning point came the day Amelia went into labor. A storm rolled in as they reached the clinic. Not the private hospital they could have easily afforded, but a public one she insisted on. For perspective, she'd said. For humility. The labor was long, complicated, And in the middle of it, a nurse panicked. Equipment shorted. Alarms beep. A young midwife froze. And then, through the haze of pain, Amelia did what she'd done once before. She looked up at the girl beside her and said, "It's okay. You know what to do." It was her own voice now. Teddy. When the baby finally arrived, silent for just 1 second too long, and then wailed with power that shook the room, Marcus collapsed in relief against the wall, hands trembling. It was a girl. They named her Elara, after a star. Because stars don't ask for permission to shine. They simply do. Elara's cry was like nothing Amelia had ever heard. Not just a sound of life, it was a claim. Declaration. The sound of something beginning that no one could take back. They placed her in Amelia's arms, still slick and wrinkled and furious at the cold. And in that moment everything went quiet again. No monitors, no nurses, not even Marcus's quiet sob in the corner. Just the two of them, breath to breath, heart to heart. Amelia whispered, "You're safe now." Marcus came beside her and stared down at the small bundle that was somehow already changing him. He'd been through boardrooms and courtrooms, media storms and public trials. Nothing had ever frightened him like holding her for the first time. Nothing had ever felt this real. They brought her home 2 days later. The villa was decorated, but not extravagantly. Amelia had asked for something intimate. Just close friends, a few soft flowers, a single bottle of vintage champagne untouched on the table. Elara slept through most of it, oblivious to the fact that powerful men and women from all over the world had come simply to catch a glimpse of her. But it wasn't until weeks later, when the house had returned to silence, that the story of Elara truly began. She was alert, watchful. Her eyes tracked shadows, her fists never clenched in fear but in curiosity. Amelia often found her staring at the moonlight through the curtains, as if it was speaking a language only she understood. Marcus watched Amelia watch her. "You know," he said one night, as they lay on the floor beside Elara's crib, "sometimes I think she's been here before." Amelia smiled without looking away. "Maybe she has. Maybe we all have. And we just forget, until someone reminds us." Years passed. Elara grew into a child with questions. Unending, layered questions that couldn't be answered with yes or no. Why do we dream? Why do people lie? Why do some people have nothing? At age 6, she asked to go to Mumbai. She had heard the story. The one they told in pieces, never all at once. A flight. Baby. The woman who cried out. The girl who answered. The chain reaction that followed. But Elara didn't want the legend. She wanted the place. People. So they went. Amara was now 8. She ran to Elara like they had known each other forever. And in a way they had. Bound by a story neither of them could remember living, but both somehow carried inside. They sat in the same hospital where Priya had delivered Amara. Now renovated, freshly painted, a plaque on the wall. In honor of courage without title. And compassion without condition. The Amara Project. Elara traced the letters with her fingers. Later, walking through the bustling street outside, her small hand tucked in Amelia's, she asked quietly, "What if that day hadn't happened? On the plane?" Amelia looked down at her. "Then you wouldn't be here." Elara paused, brow furrowing in the way it always did before something profound. "But maybe I still would. Maybe I would have found you another way." Amelia stopped, turned, kneeling down to eye level. "You think souls find each other?" Elara nodded. "Always." Behind them, Marcus took a photo. Not of the building, not of the plaque, but of that moment. Mother and daughter in the noise and color of the world, talking like time didn't exist. That photo would one day be framed in a museum. But the world didn't know that yet. It didn't know what Elara would become. That one day she'd stand on global stages and speak of health equity, of technology driven by empathy, of systems that healed not just illness but injustice. It didn't know that she'd start with mobile clinics and end with global policy. That she would build not an empire but a movement. And it certainly didn't know that all of it, all asterisk of it, started with a quiet girl in a blue cardigan. Who said yes when no one else knew what to do. Years later, when Elara was invited to speak at the World Health Assembly in Geneva, she stood not behind a podium but beside it. She requested a circle of chairs instead of a stage. There were ministers, CEOs, young physicians from war-torn nations, and exhausted nurses flown in from field hospitals. The room was thick with power but also something rarer, attention. Everyone listened because she did not speak like she was trying to be heard. She spoke like she was remembering something important, and allowing everyone else to remember it with her. "I'm not here," she began, "because I'm someone important. I'm here because someone saw pain and chose not to walk away from it. That choice didn't save one life. It saved mine before I even existed." They watched her silent. She continued. "There was no spotlight, no prize. Just a woman who chose to act. That's what medicine is. Not equipment, not degrees. It's choice. Every day. In every moment. A pause. And it's a choice we owe everyone, not just those who can afford it." The room erupted into applause. Not a standing ovation, not yet. But a quiet, reverent clapping. The kind that says we hear you. The kind that says change is possible. Afterward, she walked outside into the Swiss air, colder than she remembered. Her parents were waiting near the fountains. Amelia held a scarf in one hand, Marcus in his usual quiet coat, watching her with a smile that never faded, not after all these years. "You said it," Amelia said softly, wrapping the scarf around her daughter's shoulders. "I had to," Elara said. "It's time." Amelia tilted her head. "For what?" "For the story to belong to more than just us." And that's exactly what happened. In the months that followed, the Elara project tripled its reach. Mobile units expanded into Eastern Europe, North Africa, and parts of Southeast Asia. Medical universities began to require rotations with the program, not as charity work, but as essential clinical training. Policy shifted. Funding arrived, slowly at first, then like rain breaking through a dry sky. And Elara, she never stopped. She traveled light, wrote in journals, sat cross-legged on clinic floors and listened to mothers talk about hunger and hope in the same breath. She gave interviews reluctantly, published articles under her mother's maiden name. And every year without fail, she returned to Mumbai. She would sit with Elara beneath the old mango tree behind the house, the one that had grown with them both, and they would speak of the future as if it were something they could reach out and hold. Because in a way they could. One night, after a long day at a rural clinic in Rajasthan, Elara lay awake beneath a canvas tent, wind curling at the edges. She pulled her journal from beneath her bag and flipped to a blank page. At the top she wrote, "For the girl in the blue cardigan." And then, "Your kindness wasn't just a moment. It was a seed. And I've spent my life watering it." She closed the journal, tucked it beneath her head and slept, not knowing that years from now another girl, somewhere in a city not yet built, would stumble across that journal, in a museum dedicated not to war or politics, but to response. To the way we choose to reach across the aisle, across the noise, across the panic, and say, "I will not walk away." And maybe that girl, inspired by a story that felt like her own, would say yes in her own way. And it would all begin again. That girl's name was Noor. She was 16, quiet-eyed and sharp-minded, with a habit of disappearing into books and reappearing with ideas no one had heard before. She had found the journal by accident, tucked behind a display case labeled Humanity in Action, deep in the East Wing of the Global Health Museum in Nairobi. The paper was worn, the handwriting fluid, deliberate. The words felt like a whisper through time, reaching her not from the past, but from a place beyond time altogether. Noor read the entire journal on the museum floor. And when she closed it, she looked different. Not older, not wiser. Asterisk awakened star. She left the museum in silence, her footsteps echoing softly between the glass walls. That night she began to write. Not a story, not a summary. Plan. It began with a question. What if healthcare didn't wait for disaster? She stayed up until dawn. In the weeks that followed, Noor began to speak. First to classmates, then to community organizers, then to local clinics, where she asked impossible questions that made doctors lean in with sudden curiosity. She challenged models, proposed mobile care that anticipated outbreaks using climate data, satellite tracking, even social media signals. People told her she was young. She agreed, and worked harder. Elara heard about Noor first through a late-night email. Subject line, "You need to see this girl." The video was grainy, recorded on someone's phone, but Noor's voice was clear. She stood in front of a crowd at a local school, speaking of decentralized care, of systems that didn't rely on borders or bureaucracy, but community instinct. She talked about water access, phone alerts, and repurposing delivery drones for first aid kits in flood-prone regions. Elara watched it 3 times. Then she booked a flight. She found Noor standing in the back of a youth center, sleeves rolled up, hair braided back, explaining drone trajectory paths to a group of volunteers using sticks and stones in the dirt. She didn't look up when Elara approached. Only when the silence stretched did she glance sideways and freeze. "Elara," she said, not as a question, as a recognition. "You read it," Elara said softly. Noor nodded. Every word. They talked until dusk, then through the night. Elara didn't correct Noor's ideas. She asked her to expand them. She didn't offer a job or a scholarship. She offered space, team, lab, a place where Noor could build. 6 months later, Noor became the youngest lead architect in the Elara project's history. By 17, she launched the Preverra Network, a predictive health grid that combined local storytelling, AI analytics, and indigenous knowledge to forecast medical needs before official reports even emerged. And by 20, she stood on the same Geneva stage Elara had once stood on. Only now, Elara was in the second row. Amelia beside her. Marcus, older now, quieter, hands clasped. Noor wore no makeup, no jewelry, just a thin silver band on her wrist engraved with one name, Mara. She looked out over the sea of world leaders, tech giants, skeptics, believers, and began with a truth. We think stories end when the final sentence is written, but they don't. They echo, they seed, they root in someone else. And if we listen closely, we'll hear where they want to go next. The lights dimmed behind her, and the screen filled with maps, clusters of light where healthcare had bloomed in places long forgotten. The data pulsed like constellations. Noor turned toward the audience one last time. "And we follow those lights," she said, not to finish the story, but to make sure it never ends. In the quiet that followed, Amelia closed her eyes and smiled. 'Cause she knew. It never really started with her. It started with the voice she had used, the day she chose to rise from her seat, walk down a narrow airplane aisle and say, "I'm here. Let me help." And now, across oceans and generations, it continued. When the lights rose again in Geneva, they revealed more than applause. They revealed a shift, subtle but undeniable. Some of the most powerful people in the room were no longer watching Noor like a prodigy or a novelty. They were taking notes. Some looked shaken, inspired, challenged, as if they had seen for the first time, not just a future that could be better, but one that must be. After the summit, as the delegation dispersed, Noor stepped into the cold air beside Elara. The city lights glinted off Lake Geneva like stars that had fallen and chosen to stay. Elara handed Noor a cup of tea, still too hot to drink, and they stood in silence. "You didn't flinch," Elara said. "I couldn't," Noor replied. "There's too much at stake." Elara looked at her, proud and quiet. "You reminded them why they came." Noor smiled softly. "You reminded me why I started." That night, the two of them returned to the villa where Elara had spent her childhood. The house was quieter now. Marcus, slower on his feet, still insisted on making tea for them himself. Amelia, her hair streaked with gray, walked slowly through the garden where she once rocked Elara under the moonlight. And when Noor walked through that house, filled with old photographs, journals, medical sketches, maps, and hundreds of names etched into the walls of the foundation, she realized that this story had never been about one hero. It had always been a relay. Noor left Geneva with a fire behind her ribs. She traveled to coastal villages where the sea had crept closer every year, swallowing land and bringing disease with every tide. She met women who labored in open air, men who walked 5 hours for aspirin, children whose names were never recorded because the clinics were too far away to reach. And she did not cry. She built. The Preverra Network expanded not just in scope but in shape. Noor insisted it be open source, decentralized, not a tool owned by an institution, but one held by the communities themselves. She developed local training programs, rewrote education curricula, and insisted on platforms that listened in local dialects. She knew data meant nothing if it could not hear the people. In a village in southern Morocco, an 8-year-old named Yasmina learned to use a solar-powered tablet to report signs of waterborne illness before symptoms spread. In a refugee camp near Aleppo, Preverra drones dropped oral rehydration packets within 2 hours of a heatwave warning. And in every place where her system reached, the same symbol appeared on makeshift clinic walls. A small blue flower. A nod to the cardigan that started it all. One day, as Noor stood under a corrugated roof in Cambodia, watching a young girl successfully suture a wound on a practice pad, a journalist approached her. "How does it feel," he asked, "to be building a legacy?" She looked at the girl, at the cracked floor, at the sunlight filtering through bullet holes no one bothered to patch. Then she answered, "I'm not building a legacy. I'm building a bridge." That quote spread, not in headlines but in whispers. Doctors in Brazil began signing up for rural rotations, engineers in Seoul started donating satellite data, students in Kenya hosted midnight forums to study how Preverra worked and how it could be improved. And in Mumbai, on the same street where Elara had taken her first steps, another little girl listened to her teacher read aloud from a book titled The Children of Light, How One Act of Kindness Changed the World. When she got home that day, she told her mother she wanted to become someone who healed the world with ideas. Her mother, now in her 40s, smiled and hugged her tight. And in that embrace lived every thread of the story. The girl in the blue cardigan, a flight, a birth, choice, and the chain of hands that kept reaching forward, never letting the light go out years later when Noor was older, her hair streaked with silver and her voice steadier than ever. She found herself in a quiet garden in Kyoto, under the shade of a cherry blossom tree just beginning to bloom. She sat on a wooden bench with a young woman beside her, Aiko, a researcher from Okinawa with fire in her heart and questions that never seemed to end. Aiko was part of the next wave. She had grown up in a coastal town where rising tides stole more homes than history could count. She studied engineering, then epidemiology, then chose to leave her post in a global tech firm to join the Preverra initiative. Noor had seen pieces of herself in Aiko, just as Elara had seen Noor once. The chain continued. "Do you ever wish," Aiko asked quietly, "that things had been different? That the world had changed faster?" Noor looked up at the petals drifting down like slow snow. "No," she said, "because the slow change teaches us how to keep it. If it came too fast, we might have mistaken it for luck." Aiko nodded, but her eyes held something deeper. Fear maybe. Of not being enough. Of failing the story. "I don't know if I can do what you've done," she confessed. Noor didn't respond right away. She reached into her satchel and pulled out an old journal, worn, with soft corners and a faded ribbon tucked between pages. She handed it to Aiko. "I didn't write most of this," Noor said. "But the woman who did, she didn't know she'd change anything either." Aiko opened it. The handwriting was steady, a little faded with time, but every word felt alive. She stopped at the first page. "For the girl in the blue cardigan." Her fingers hovered over the ink. "This belonged to Elara," she whispered. Noor nodded. "And it was given to me when I needed it. It's yours now." Aiko stared at it, overcome. "But I'm just beginning. That's exactly when it matters most." From that moment, something settled in Aiko's chest. Not pressure. Permission star. Try. Fill. To build. To write her own chapter in a story that had never needed heroes, only hearts that refused to stand still. That night, under the lantern glow of Kyoto's narrow streets, Aiko opened the journal again. She didn't read it all. Just one passage. You are not alone. You were never alone. This work, this love, it echoes. Cross oceans. Cross generations. Keep walking. You would. In time, Aiko would go on to revolutionize climate-adaptive health systems in the Pacific Rim. She would develop sea-floating medical hubs powered by wind and tide, capable of responding within hours to both natural disasters and epidemics. Her work would save millions, not through miracles, but through preparation, design, and empathy. And she would do it all with a single journal always packed in her travel case. Years after that, a little boy in Chile, whose family lived on the edge of a salt flat once thought uninhabitable, would discover an old drone buried near the base of an abandoned clinic. The name Preverra was faint on its side. He would be the one to trace it back, to ask questions, to start building again. And somewhere, in the silence of a future not yet written, someone would say, it all began with a flight. And someone who didn't look away. And the story would live on. Not in books, not even in memory, but in every hand that reaches forward, without needing a reason. That little boy's name was Matteo. He was 9 years old, barefoot more often than not, with a curious mind that refused to sleep and eyes that seemed to hold starlight even in daylight. He lived in a village where the wind sang through broken fences and water came once every 3 days if the pumps worked. His father, a mechanic, fixed things that were long past saving. His mother, a midwife, delivered life with hands steadier than machines. The day Matteo found the old drone, he wasn't looking for anything special. He had followed the sound of a lost goat through the dry salt air, wandered behind the ruins of an old health outpost, and there it was, half buried, wings chipped, light panel dulled by time. But something about it called to him. He pulled it from the sand like a fossil, brushed it clean with the edge of his sleeve, and carried it home like treasure. His father laughed when he saw it. Dead thing, he said, tapping its side. Nothing left in this. But Matteo didn't believe in dead things. He believed in forgotten things. And forgotten things could be remembered. It took weeks of trial and error, charging the ancient solar panel, rewiring the circuits with copper pulled from broken radios, decoding bits of data still embedded in the core. But one afternoon the drone blinked to life. And with it something else awakened. Not just the machine, but a transmission. Faint, fractured, but real. A snippet of Noor's voice. One of her training dispatches. Just a few words. This isn't about who leads. It's about who listens. Because that's where healing begins. Matteo sat frozen. He played it again. Then again. He didn't know who the woman was, not yet. But something inside him knew. This message mattered. This voice came from somewhere far away. And it had come for him. He took the drone to his school, where Miss Elena, who once worked for an international NGO before returning to teach in her home village, stared at it with wide eyes. Preverra, she whispered. I haven't seen one of these in 10 years. What is it? Matteo asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she sat down beside him and for the first time, told the children of a world they had only glimpsed. Of Noor, of Elara, of a project that crossed borders, languages, disasters, and time. She spoke of floating clinics and early warning networks. Of kindness woven into code. Of stories that didn't begin with power, but with presence. Matteo listened. And after school he didn't go home. He stayed behind, opened the drone, and began documenting everything he found. Every packet. Every line of code. Every voice recording. He shared them with Miss Elena, who began uploading them to a lost access server marked only by a symbol. A single blue flower. The signal caught. First in Santiago, where a data archivist recognized the fragment and shared it with a retired Preverra systems engineer. Then in Johannesburg. Then in Dhaka. Like seeds in wind, the pieces scattered and found soil. And from those fragments, a new vision bloomed. The children in Matteo's village began training on repurposed tablets, learning how to spot early signs of respiratory disease, water contamination, even mental health crises. They coded in Spanish, in Mapudungun, in silence, where words were not yet formed but meaning still burned clear. And through it all Mateo kept listening. Years later, at a global gathering in Accra, a young man with thick curls and salt on his skin stood before a new generation of leaders. He spoke not from theory but from memory, of a broken drone, buried voice, a belief that healing didn't begin with institutions, but with someone choosing to care. In the crowd, sitting quietly near the back, Aiko watched him, and smiled, because she knew. This was how it always began. Not with thunder, but with a whisper carried far enough to become a wave years past. And the story, like all living things, continued to grow, to breathe, to change shape. Mateo, now in his 30s, stood on the threshold of a new chapter. He had become one of the foremost architects of decentralized health tech in the Southern Hemisphere. But when people asked how he got started, he never gave them the full resume. He would simply say, "I listened to a voice the world had forgotten." And he never stopped listening. One evening, during the Equinox Summit in Quito, a global gathering held every 5 years to align health innovation with planetary shifts, he was asked to close the final night. Delegates from 127 countries were present. Children watched from home in remote villages, from floating classrooms, from highland observatories powered by wind and sun. He stepped onto the stage without notes, and he told the story, not from the beginning because it had none, but from the moment a young woman stood on a crowded airplane and helped bring life into the world. He spoke of kindness that never asked for recognition, of systems built on empathy, not ego. He shared how a blue cardigan, a journal, a whisper from a drone had each become sparks. He named the women who had made the difference. Amelia, Elara, or Go. And he named the thousands who had never been on magazine covers, who had never spoken at summits, asterisk, but who had acted anyway, star. He ended with a truth so simple, the room held its breath. We are not saviors. We are not inventors of hope. We are guardians of what already exists. Eunice, connection, courage. We carry it forward. That's all. And in that silence, as the last light of the sun dipped behind the Andes, a breeze passed through the open air of the summit hall. Almost like a breath. The audience stood, not in applause, but in honor, for the story, for the voices, for the endless chain of hands that had never let go. And so it ended, not with a full stop, but with an open page, waiting for the next reader, the next listener, the next quiet soul somewhere in the world, ready to step forward and say, "I'm here. Let me help."